we start now? Can we start? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. Our topic today is Beyond Lip Service, Taking Action for Diversity. I first of all want a little announcement. Many of you may have came to connect with Sally Lehrman, the head of the Trust Project. Sally cannot be with us today. We are going to persevere and do a panel in any event. So let me introduce our panelists first of all. Oh, first of all, I'm sorry. My name is Kathy English. I am head of content integrity and editorial standards for Dotdash Meredith. It's a New York-based digital and print publishing company. I come to this topic after doing a fellowship at the Reuters Institute at Oxford in 2020, in which we spent a lot of time talking about critical issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, asking ourselves questions about who has a seat at the table, who has a voice in the room, and came to look at a lot of the history, which we'll get into. So let me introduce our guests, first of all. Right beside me, pinch hitting, just decided to join, just agreed to join, Jody Rave Spotted Bear. Jody is founding director of the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, a nonprofit organization located on the Fort Berthold Reserve in North Dakota in the United States. Jody runs an independent digital news site called Buffalo's Fire. She's an award-winning journalist and opinion writer who has reported on American Indian issues for many years and won awards for reporting. Beside Jody, we have Charity Brown. Charity is head of newsroom, product, and digital initiatives at the Washington Post. She's been there 15 years, worked on many projects, including the Trust Project. Now she's the deputy director who works with many departments across the company, engineering, product, legal, finance, to help find and create newsroom workflow experiences and things that lead to better reader experiences. Beside Charities, Dr. Mackenzie Price. Dr. Price, I have the privilege of working with, is the director of Antibias initiatives at Dotdash Meredith, where she works across our content integrity and content operations and standards teams. She has established Dotdash Meredith's first ever anti-bias review board, which she's going to tell you about. In her role, Dr. Price leads the review board. She advises brand teams on creating inclusive content and partners with content integrity to develop internal standards for bias-free, trustworthy, expert content, which is, I think, what we're all interested in creating. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction than I might have as moderator because I am also pinch hitting for Sally, and she does send her apologies. So I think we all know that journalism, particularly in the Western world, has failed in being accountable to the public for those critical values of diversity, inclusion, and equality. And whether that be in representation of Indigenous peoples in Canada, which is an experience I have more experience in, African Americans in the United States, or Muslims in the UK, journalism has had a dismal record in meeting its social responsibility function of creating fair, accurate, proportionate coverage. For many decades, media organizations, and I think it has to be said that we're largely run by white men, have talked about the pressing need for representative newsrooms and representative coverage. But there's just been minimal action and minimal accountability attached to those words, which is why we came up with the concept of lip service. I would say that no further evidence of this is required than the words of the 1968 Kerner Commission in the United States. This was the report of the U.S. National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. And I only came across these words a couple years ago, right at the height of the George Floyd reckoning, and I was stunned by how relevant they were. The Kerner Commission criticized the U.S. media for contributing to racial misunderstanding through biased, unfair coverage. And this is what it said: along with the country as a whole, the press has too long basked in a white world. Looking out of it, if at all, with white man's eyes and a white perspective 50 years ago, more than that, 1968. I began to look into why is this so? Why have we been talking about this so long and not achieved any action? And one of the things I found in a lot of the literature is that there's been a fail to normalize diversity, inclusion imperatives as part of ethical journalism, as what we look at as trustworthy journalism, that it's been something outside of the normalized, what we think about as quality ethical journalism, that there's been superficial attention paid to it. And it's the authors of many of the reports concluded that journalism overall needs to clearly identify core ethical reasons to diversify, that content that is diverse and inclusive is accurate and fair, which is what trustworthy journalism is. And then I had some involvement in the Trust Project in my previous role at the Toronto Star. I had brought in the Trust Project indicators and was struck by the fact that the Trust Project was one of the first of the trust initiatives that have happened since 2016 that incorporated a trust indicator called diverse voices right into the indicators. And it asks the questions, how do we represent our community in a fairer way? How do we make sure that we are not covering our communities with stereotypes and bias? The Trust Project, for those of you who don't know, I'll just give you a quick little bit of background. It's a consortium of more than 200 newsrooms around the world that are committed to indicators of trust, and the indicators of trust are related to things like accuracy, fairness, diversity, making clear distinctions between opinion and news content. They seek to show the reliability and trustworthiness of content. Sally, the Trust Project founder, I asked her, why did you make diversity a Trust Project indicator? And she said, because all of the public interactions that they had, they did a lot of studies with the public to understand what it is that makes trustworthy journalism. And it was the public who kept saying that, if I don't see myself reflected, how can I trust you? So that's why we wanted to come together today and talk about this connection between diversity and trust, but more important, moving beyond just talking about it to finding out what some news organizations are doing about it. So I'd like to start with Charity Brown of the Washington Post. The Washington Post was an early member of the Trust Project. Did a lot of positive stuff, I think. So maybe you can tell us more about that, Charity.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And so Kathy is absolutely right. The Washington Post was an early adopter of the trust indicators. There are 8 in total. Some examples of the trust indicators are things like labels. So story labels, which give the reader some sort of idea about what type of content is being presented. So those story labels can include perspective, analysis, breaking news, so that the reader has an idea of what type or what lens they're reading from. We also have in addition to that, photos of our journalists that appear on those story items as well, right? So you're reading a piece of content, and you're also able to see exactly who reported it. In addition to that, there is a link that takes the reader to the profile of the author, so they can actually read about the author's education. They can see their title, their exact title. They can learn a little bit more about them from their full bio, as well as see all of the content that is associated with that author's byline. And that's in an effort to be as transparent as possible with the readers themselves. The Washington Post is a legacy organization. It was founded in, I believe, 1877. I think this is our 145th year. And so as we continue to report the news, it's really a matter of molding our presentation or display so that the reader has as much information as possible about who's covering the news, how we're covering it, and the distinct voices that are being presented in those works. One of the key factors of the trust organization is diverse voices, and so with the racial reckoning that happened in 2020, 2020 was a very interesting year, mostly defined by three things, which were protests, the pandemic, and politics, right? So the protests themselves, our publisher at the time, he identified that there was a need for more discussion about race and more inclusion in terms of diversity and diverse voices. So there was a major expansion that happened where we hired dozens of additional reporters and editors to focus specifically on some of the issues that have been really plaguing the nation. So for instance, we hired a health and science reporter to specifically focus on racial disparities in health, given the pandemic, right? Also, we hired a writer for our About Us newsletter, which About Us focuses on diverse news. So, for instance, we've written articles about the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's now more mainstream, as well as other articles that are affecting other groups, whether it be racial groups or gender, accessibility, right? Sexual orientation, things of that nature. And so we've really embraced the indicators to fully push forward this idea of more inclusion in terms of our content and the display of it. So it's been a process for us, but we are continuing to push forward with those initiatives.
Charity, you use the word transparency, and one of the asks of the Trust Project is that we be transparent about our staffing and the diversity of our staffs. I know in pushing the indicators through in my newspaper in Canada at the time, there was resistance. There was resistance from the very top, from HR, from publishers saying, we're not going to publish those numbers. I often point people to the Washington Post, which has published those numbers. Can you tell me about how that came about, and was there some challenge involved?
Yes, we publish our demographics for, and is this still on? Yes, okay. We publish our demographics as part of the ASNI survey. And it's not just us, it's other organizations that try to make sure that those demographics are available to the public. So you know how many women we have working in the newsroom, how many Latino, Latinx, Hispanics we have in the newsroom as well. Et cetera. And so that initiative was pretty organic from the top down. There were some discussions with the Guild that led to it, but that seems to be something that we're embracing, and also it's something that is discussed internally as we keep trying to push the mark and move forward. So other organizations, I would highly encourage them to participate in that, because it gives people who are looking to be a part of your organization an idea of your values, right? What you're looking for in terms of your staff. So I think it's a great indication of, where you fall in terms of diversity.
Do you know if the Washington Post readership responds to it at all?
I think so. I wouldn't say that necessarily there's any sort of survey that we put out, but we are looking at how we can reach younger populations, more diverse populations. There is an initiative that we've started called Next Generation. And so we're trying to figure out what the Washington Post looks like going forward. Like, as I said before, because it's a legacy brand, there's quite a bit of history there. There's quite a bit of, we've always done it this way, right? But now we're looking more so forward as in, okay, well, what are the digital initiatives that we need to focus on so that our readership realizes that we are trying to fully engage with them. So there is certain people in and around the room who are actually looking at that and working on that. One comes to mind, one of our editors, Travis Lyles, he is our Instagram editor, and he is focusing on how we reach that specific population of the readership, presenting or taking a story that is published online and making it easily digestible for a younger audience, right? And that's a part of diversity too, generational diversity, right? So there's constantly constant ideas, constant brainstorming. And so it's as I said before, it's really a process.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to you to ask you some more questions after. And I will just say that one of the points that Sally made is that in creating the Trust Project Diverse Voices Indicator, they look to the Maynard Institute, which is in the U.S., for guidance on thinking about diversity across gender, generation, race, ethnicity, class, geography, with also considerations for ideology and religion. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about a wide span of things that we need to think about. I'd like to move to Mackenzie next. Mackenzie, tell us about the Dotdash Meredith Antibias Review Board and how it came to be.
Absolutely. Pull this a little closer. Hello. Thanks for having me. My name is Mackenzie Price, and as you now know, I'm a part of Dotdash Meredith, which is based in, not Washington, D.C., New York. I live in Washington, D.C., and I read the Washington Post. As the director of anti-bias initiatives for Dotdash Meredith, myself and my colleagues have three main goals and responsibilities. So we work across the 50-plus brands that are a part of Dotdash Meredith to develop editorial standards and process for each of them. We also audit content across those brands for bias and prejudice, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. And then we also make recommendations for specific edits or changes that need to be made through Dotdash Meredith's quality assurance process, essentially. And so the real connection, or one of the many connections between that process and trust and trust indicators, is that diverse voices indicator that we've been talking about asks that organizations, one, think about what steps they're going to take to include diverse perspectives, and then two, they ask that you think about how are you covering and including those perspectives, and is it being done at all, or is it being done through stereotypes, for example? And that's really what bias or prejudice is about, acting on or including some kind of pre-existing belief, stereotype in the language you use, the images you use, and that's really what anti-bias as a piece of content integrity and content quality at Dotdash Meredith is focused on. And so that's where the audit and review process comes in. And having this review board be a part of Dotdash Meredith's process dates back to 2020. And at that time, all of the brands that were a part of this publishing group were really setting their own internal goals in terms of how they were going to look at the content they had in their libraries and audit that for prejudice and bias in language and images. And so what we did is assemble a panel of subject matter experts who have a connection to fields like finance or public health or medicine or food, visual culture, and also a connection to different types of bias or an understanding of those issues. So in addition to subject matter experts on finance, we have subject matter experts on disability and accessibility and race and sexual orientation. And so we take all of that and audit the content that is the product of all of the brands that we work with and make changes and recommendations, again, through our regular quality assurance process. And so that's what the board, one of the main things that this panel does. And as I said, in 2020, we first started working with the brands at Dotdash Meredith to develop goals for how much content we were going to look at or what it was going to be. And we've been doing that. It's happening right now. We've been doing it since 2020. And just to talk a little bit more about what we are actually looking at and what it means to find bias in language and images. So we think really specifically about what the style standards are going to be for any given brand. So that can be being very intentional about trying to use destigmatizing language for different aspects of the health content we produce. We think about if we're going to, we want to make sure we're going to be accurate. So when we talk about older adults, or really any age in over the life course, we try and use developmentally accurate terms and stay away from euphemisms so that we can have that accuracy, which is a part of being bias-free. And so we look at really intentional language choices like that. And one of the things that I think is really important about doing this work, so doing this continual audit process and having a team of people who are focused on this and take the findings from those audits and bring them back into editorial standards, is that this is a really specific strategy for bringing a diversity initiative directly into the product that the brands at Dotdash Meredith create, which is the content that readers read and use and rely on to make decisions. And so that's something that I think is really important about the work that we do.
Can you tell us a couple of specific recommendations, changes that the board has recommended that have moved forward?
Sure. So a lot of the changes that we make are things that, as I mentioned, get fed back into the style guides and editorial standards that all of the brands use. So that would be an example of something that we adopted would be looking at content that we have that's talking about pregnancy. Now, people might be familiar with making a change to have content about pregnancy be gender inclusive or gender neutral, so saying pregnant people instead of pregnant women, for example. But you can take that specific guideline and not just apply it to content that's talking about pregnancy, but content that's talking about menstruation, for example, or any content that appears in any of our health brands, and trying to make that gender inclusive.
And I know, since we're in the same organization, it's very complex, lots of different editorial teams. Is this work accepted across the board? Is there sometimes people have to be convinced? What's the culture around doing this work?
In my experience, I have really found that because this process is a part of a quality assurance and integrity process that even before I came to Dotdash Meredith was in place, that's been a real part of the success of this, that because we're a part of a pre-existing process that really normalizes the idea that we're thinking really specifically about how inclusive our language is, or how inclusive it can be if there are steps we want to take. And so being a part of a process that, to be frank, every brand has to participate in means that everyone has to participate in the process of thinking about the quality of the product we're putting out. And so I found that to be very successful.
That's great. Okay, we'll come back and ask some more questions. Jody, you've jumped in today with no preparation, but I did tell you a little bit of what we'd ask. You're about to join the Trust Project. Your Buffalo Fire, that's Buffalo's Fire is going to be part of the Trust Project. What do you hope to achieve in the way of audience trust by becoming part of the Trust Project?
Yeah, I have no problem jumping in at the last minute. I want to just, before I answer your question, I would kind of like to do a little survey of your audience and find out if anybody has heard of the Trust Project before you came into this room. Can you raise your hand? Yeah, good. That's good. And are you members of the Trust Project, or you're just, okay, we have at least one person wanting to, and that's a part of it. And to answer your question, so a little bit of background. I'm American Indian. I'm Mandan and Hidatsa on my mother's side. I'm a Lakota on my father's side. I worked in the mainstream press for about 15 years. 11 of those years were reporting on American Indian issues for Lee newspapers. And then I moved back home to an American Indian reservation called Fort Berthold in North Dakota in the United States. And I wanted to do the normal things I would have did for the mainstream press, but I really stepped into a whole different world of journalism, because the majority of newspapers owned throughout the United States, on reservations, which we call Indian country, the majority of those newspapers are owned by tribal governments. And so if you just imagine if all newspapers where you lived were owned by the government, what kind of trust and transparency issues might you run up against? I run up against those issues a lot with the tribal governments owning even my own local newspaper on the Fort Berthold reservation. So they control the editorial boards, they control the funding, they control basically the content. There's a lot of censorship on what gets printed. Again, I'm speaking for my local newspaper. And so that's the tribe-owned newspaper. I run an independent digital news site called Buffalo's Fire. And Kathy had mentioned the Maynard Institute, and I was a fellow there a couple of years ago. And Sally came in and she did a presentation for the Maynard Fellows. And I was instantly gravitated to every word she had to say. When you're part of the Trust Project, there's 8 indicators that Charity had mentioned. A few of those things really did catch my attention, such as best practices. And that is, who owns your newspaper? Is it a tribal government? Is it a different government? Is it a political organization? I think our readers, if we're going to gain trust, I'm not sure what things are like where you live at, but in the United States, there's, the press is dealing with a lot of lack of trust from readers. It's a very polarized environment, and I think newspapers could really live another day to get more transparency into their newspapers. So just to kind of wrap up here, we really think it's important that our independent newspaper, let our readers know who is writing our stories. For example, the tribal-owned newspaper, it's usually a lot of political hires. So we want people to know what our reporters' credentials are. We want people to know who owns the newspaper, just as a couple of the key areas that we're focused on.
Okay, quite a journey ahead. The diverse voices indicators, one of the questions it asks are, what are your newsroom's efforts and commitments to bring in diverse perspectives across social and demographic differences? So, which implies an effort, at the reporting level to, sources. Sources should be more diverse. You're not talking to the same old people all the time. And I'm using old in the wrong way, I don't mean old. Think about your words. Charity, you are looking at an initiative to document sources and the diversity of sources. Can you tell us about that? I'm really intrigued.
Sure thing. So yes, that is a part of, we have an initiative called Wapo 360. And it is mostly focused on content categorization. However, our diversity and inclusion managing editor, Krista Thompson, came to us with the idea of tracking our sources to see, are our sources diverse? And diversity here again can span race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. And that will help us in terms of having data helps you in terms of making sure that various departments are reaching out to a wide array of sources who can provide insight in terms of our stories. The Wapo 360 initiative is actually under me. I'm running the newsroom leg of it, along with our engineering, advertising, as well as analytics departments. And we really feel like this is a vital part of advancing the idea of including more diverse voices. It's in addition to having people that we're talking to in terms of the communities, right? And getting their insights, but then also looking to experts who can provide that additional layer of information, and not necessarily looking to cisgender white males as the experts, right? There are a variety of people who work in various organizations who can provide additional insights, and we need to be figuring out who those people are and reaching out to them. So we hope to fully implement that by next year at the latest, as this project is just getting off the ground. It's very much in its infancy, but it's essential.
Next year you'll come back and talk about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Does that involve at the reporter level, reporters tracking who they're interviewing, who they're talking to?
Yes, absolutely. So currently that is how we're doing it, is by having the reporters and assignment editors actually do some of that tracking. Our local or metro department has been really active in terms of that. These are the reporters and editors who are covering the news that focuses on the DMV, which is DC, Maryland, and Virginia. We're currently doing it that way, but the initiative, honestly, Kathy, is looking more so at a way to automate the process.
Okay.
Right? So if there's some sort of way to figure out how to, since we're scanning articles, right, for content categorization, can we also extract the sources that are included in those articles, create some sort of listing for that, and see, okay, well, National has referenced John Doe X amount of times over the last 2 months. Are there others who could be referenced? And we hope that this is something that we can actually do.
Okay. I've been involved in efforts to do that with gender, and it was very easy to track the gender of sources. It becomes harder with other elements of diversity.
Right, exactly. It does become more difficult, and certainly, yes, we've seen preliminary results where it's easier with gender. We tried our sports department to see about those sources there, but we think, once we have names, then we can do some sort of manual lift or manual effort to include background information. And then that can be, a source listing of truth in a sense.
Okay. Mackenzie, you are a linguist, have a doctorate in linguistics. You think about language a lot and the power of language, the power of words to convey meaning. One of the examples we've talked about is talk to your doctor. Can you expand on that about what's the problem with talk to your doctor, which is often found in health content, right?
Yes. Well, where to begin? There is, I think that the basic idea is that no choice in language is neutral, which sometimes makes people nervous, and that's okay. But no choice is neutral, and so when we think about that phrase, talk to your doctor, there are a lot of assumptions added into that, and if we're trying to have our content not contain bias, that means we have to question those assumptions. And so when you give the advice, talk to your doctor, some of those assumptions include there is a provider that you're seeing who's a doctor, that you might be able to engage with them or follow up with them, and that just doesn't really capture all of the ways that people interact with care and interact with healthcare systems. And so a shift to talk to a provider has some fewer assumptions and creates a little more space for different ways that people might get information or advice or access to care. And to take it a step further, one of the big conversation that at Dotdash Meredith we really started having about talk to your doctor versus talk to a provider also went hand in hand with thinking about how some of the same content that was advising people to talk to your doctor might also advise someone to call 911 or essentially seek emergency services. And if we think about what a lot of the conversations, especially in our organization, were like in 2020, we were having a conversation about interacting with policing, and one of the ways that that does happen is through calls to emergency services. And so in that bigger context, call 911 is not neutral advice. And what that means for a publisher that's giving advice is to really think about, are there other things that we should be advising readers or people using this content to do? Is there more thinking we need to do around recommendations around emergency services and also recommendations around telling people to seek out care? So that's that core example, talk to your doctor, and then the kind of network of other questions that we ask around that.
Mm-hmm. And I will say I just joined Dotdash Meredith in late summer, and I find this work groundbreaking and I've learned so much from you and from the Antibias Review Board in that type of thinking that makes you think through a phrase that is inherently biased, but unconsciously so you don't even realize it until you go through that process of thinking it through and understanding. So I find it just quite fascinating. I want to open this up to questions, and I would also love to hear if any of your organizations are doing anything that you think is making a difference, that's moving the dial on diversity, equity, inclusion, to be doing more than talking about it. And we'll open it to questions. Because they want to be able to pick up the questions for the live stream, if you could ask it, and then I will repeat it so that it will be picked up. Questions? Comments? Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. First question was to Charity. mentioned all the things that the Washington Post is doing in terms of pushing on this diversity agenda. Okay.
Can I repeat the question?
Can you hear this okay? Okay, fine. Yeah, so first question to Charity. You mentioned all the changes that you've been making at the Washington Post, and I wondered, as a journalist of colour, have you felt the difference? Have you felt more of a sense of inclusion since these measures have been implemented? What's it felt like? What's the difference felt like in the last couple of years as a journalist of colour at a newspaper organisation like the Washington Post? And Mackenzie, I wanted to ask you, you talked about auditing, and I just wondered what conclusions you'd reached on the basis of your audit, whether any particular biases which were worse or particularly stood out that we really need to be challenging, that were inherent.
Oh.
Is that better? Yeah, all right. So the question is, what are some of the findings of this audit? So the simplest answer is yes, there is bias, but that is what we expect. That's why we do the audit. And I think that the significance of going through the content that's in the library is really being able to then be able to update that content and make some of those changes. And so those updates can be anything from really specific language changes, like replacing "talk to your doctor" with a long list of things you could replace that with, depending on the context. But it's also thinking about themes that people might not question. So one of the ones that I have been particularly interested in is thinking about how all of the different ways that colonialism gets kind of covered and normalized in content that you might read about all kinds of things, but especially around food and food production, right? And so that's an example of a theme that really came out of that audit, of something to pay attention to. That's an example I find particularly interesting.
That's a good one, Mackenzie. So the question was for me, since the initiation of the changes from the racial reckoning, what have I noticed in terms of the organization, and how has it been as a journalist of color? I will say that, yes, the changes have been fantastic. They've sparked a number of ideas and initiatives in and around the room that I don't necessarily know if management would have previously been open to them. And certainly hope springs eternal in terms of progress, right? There's steps that are being made, and they're being solidified in a way that they're being solidified by process and standardization, which I think provides for a level of equity. Having a standard, instead of there being subjective decisions, that can help in terms of the equity of an organization. But we still have more to go. There is a lot more that needs to be done, and it's going to take time. That's the part of this process that I don't think people realize is it took us so much time to get here. So then it's going to take us time to get to a different place in terms of the journey. but it's getting better, I think, and certainly I am encouraged by the expansion that continues to happen at the organization. As I said before, we just hired a diversity and inclusion managing editor. We've never had a D&I managing editor. A managing editor is part of the executive suite of the newsroom. So we now have, an additional person at the table who is making decisions about the overall organization. And as it relates to diversity and inclusion specifically, the organization also hired a diversity and inclusion director in the HR department to also assist in terms of hiring company-wide, because it's not just the newsroom. As I said before, we have the newsroom, yes, but then we also have other departments such as analytics and engineering, and it's a massive company, right? So there needs to be inclusion at all levels, right? So yes, I am definitely encouraged, and I hope to see more from the Post.
Hi, I have a question for Ms. Judy. As a former local reporter and publisher, I'm quite interested in how challenging it was to set up independent local media in a community not used to. As I figured out, all the news were run by tribal government, and how challenging it is to gain the trust of the community as independent media. And one more thing, greetings to Sally if she watches.
I'm sure Sally will appreciate your thoughts. Yes, so to answer that question, I didn't think it would be that difficult to set up an independent newspaper in my community, but it's been very difficult because we have leaders who lead through fear. And so that tends to silence people, and they're not so willing to be quoted. However, I've been a journalist for a long time, reporting for the mainstream press, so people knew who I was when I came home. And so I had a built-in audience, and I do have, a level of trust with readers. I think readers know that if they want the real news, they'll read our website. Not that it doesn't have, its share of challenges, because, again, people are afraid to speak up. But I just had a story published yesterday about tribal corruption, and I'm glad I was out of the country. But it's a story that needed to be done, and unfortunately, because the majority of tribes in the United States, we have 570 federally recognized tribes, and the majority of them do not have open records laws or Freedom of Information Act laws. And so as the founder of the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, this is one thing that I'm working in my own community. I'm going to put forth a ballot measure for our community to vote on changing our tribal constitution to create and amend it to add a Freedom of Information Act. I realized I will never be able to do my job unless we have access to records. So it's a systemic change that we have to make, and we will. I hired an attorney, a lawyer, and she's working on that ballot measure language. I should be able to see a good draft of it. We need to take it to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They need to approve the language. Then we need to come back and have a vote from the people and let the people have a voice to say if they want open records. And I know enough about my community that that's their number one concern is transparency in our tribal government. And I think as a journalist, they deserve transparency in knowing where their news comes from, which is why I really embrace the concept of the indicators and the trust project, because people really want to know where their news is coming from and who are the sources. You know, is this opinion piece, is this a news source? You know, is the reporter qualified to, you know, report on this particular subject matter? So, short answer, yes, it's difficult, and we have to make systemic changes, but it's really important. And just one last thing, not only are we planning to incorporate the Trust Project into our little digital newspaper on the reservation, but through our parent organization, the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, we want to incorporate or share this idea with tribal newspapers across the country and have them also incorporate the 8 trust indicators for the sake of their readers. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Yes. You want to come up here and...
Shout quite loud. Okay. Otherwise, okay. I'm from the. I think they need you to. Oh, okay. It's for the live stream. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm from the Danish School of Media and Journalism, and we have a problem because all our students almost are white, middle class, and we can't get a more diverse group to apply for our school. And I think in Denmark it's free education is paid and it's free, so it's not a money issue. I think it's another. So I would like some inspiration. What do we do? How do we get others than white middle class? Because then we just reproduce the problem in the media.
Go ahead.
I taught at a journalism school for 10 years, and that was an ongoing issue, was recruiting, having more diversity coming in. And, you know, this was some 25 years ago, and the idea was if we could have a more diverse student body, then the industry problems would get taken care of. That did not turn out to happen. It's an ongoing recruitment issue. Yeah. I don't know if anyone's got the answer, but I think everyone has the problem. And is it better in the U.S.?
No. I echo your sentiments, Kathy, and certainly, yes, we see that problem as well. So we have an internship program that I assist with. It's a summer program, and one of the things that we've tried to do is to make sure that the word is getting out, especially amongst the community college sector. I'm not exactly sure if Denmark has a division such as that, but community colleges are generally 2-year programs, and they tap into the community itself, right? So if you are someone who is looking to advance your education, this is generally an option for you if, say, for instance, you are unable to do the traditional 4-year experience for undergraduate. And that has been especially helpful for us because we are able to not only pull in the diverse grouping, but also it presents journalism as an option for perhaps communities who weren't originally thinking about it. I think that the industry as a whole we could do a better job of making sure that we are actually, pushing this idea forward that journalism it's a good thing, and that there are spaces and opportunities for people of color in it. So yeah, there's more work to be done, but certainly that is a way that we're trying to tackle it. Are there more questions?
Do we have other questions over here?
Hi. My question I think is probably for you, Charity. You can probably hear me. I didn't want to. No, it has to for the live stream. Yeah. So I work with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So we've also started contact tracking of our sources.
Yes.
So it gives you a good awareness. Then what? Where do you go next? What are you hoping? Because I know you're also at the beginning of that. So.
Right, exactly. That's a great question. So by having the data, what we're hoping to do is to then analyze it and then be able to take action based on it. So say, for instance, if in terms of our Outlook section, we notice that the sources are leaning heavily towards one group or another, we will then move forward with possibly training or policies or standards, guidelines that help the newsroom in terms of reaching out to other sources. Not only that, but then also creating maybe lists of people or individuals who could also be utilized as sources for those various areas of expertise and or knowledge. Yes, it is something that we're trying to figure out what to do next with, and so it's in steps or stages. But we're confident that once we have the numbers, then we can make moves based off of that information or those stats.
I'm told we need to wrap up, and I want to thank everyone for coming today. If you want any further information about the Trust Project, the website has lots of details, and any of us would be happy to talk to you about the initiatives in our companies as well. I just want to conclude by saying we call this beyond lip service, taking action for diversity. We really hope that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're not having these same discussions, that the action will have been effective. And that, Charity, you said it takes time. I've had editors telling me for 30 years it takes time. So we can't take 30 more years. We need to make this happen. So thank you, everyone. You are amazing. Oh my God.
I have to run for the next one.
Where are you going to be tonight? Are you around?
Are you coming to the? Is there a Rights Center?
I don't think I was invited to that one. We have are you come to the bar later tonight so we can have a beer, okay? Have a drink. I'll buy you one glass of wine.
Are we on WhatsApp? Are you on my WhatsApp?
I don't think so, but I've got you on email, so I'll send you a note.